Hello, everybody, and welcome back to your favorite show, A Man Drinks Coffee in His Backyard. Previously on the program, we were looking into the ramifications of possible universal health care versus the true libertarian stance of taxation is theft. And, of course, the episode before that is the legendary Jeff Plays with Bunnies episode. I know that was one of my favorites, and probably one of yours, too. Today, we're going to be talking about something that's actually kind of interesting and important to me, and should be important to you as well. We're going to be talking about the scientific consensus. What in the world is the scientific consensus? Archery break. Now, a lot of people really don't quite understand what the scientific consensus is supposed to be. They just think like, well, that's what the majority of scientists all are saying is the truth. No, that's really not what it is. In fact, the scientific consensus is something that we reach through a very complicated series of different steps. And I will take you through them right now. A man has a question. This man looks at the natural world and says, "World, I wonder how this thing happens." And he looks at it for a while, and he says, well, I bet it happens because of blank. He makes an observation. Then he goes and he measures and tests the thing that he wishes to understand to find out whether or not his question was right or whether it was wrong. In many ways, some people like to approach this with the initial idea that they want to make an observation that's easy and then try and break it. That's also another one they try and do. But ultimately, this is to design some sort of test, some sort of study, to look at it, to measure it, and then to see if it works. And that's only the first real step. The second step is then he takes how he did it, what results he got, he puts it all together, and he sends it off to people who do the same thing that he does. And he says, hey, see if you can break this. See if it stands the test of your rigorous treatment. And then they test it. And then if so far, yes, it seems like it's good, then it continues on. If they say, no, this is all fucked up and it's broken, then it stops right there. Changes are made. Try the test again. So let's say that, in fact, yes, it seems to look totally fine. It is then published. That work is then published. So that is it just going into the pile of evidence, right? No. The other thing you have to think about is something called impact factor. Journals, the scientific journals where all of these things are being collected together, not all journals are the same. A lot of them are predatory or pay for play, where they will literally publish anything you want if you're willing to send them money. These are very real, and those have a very low impact factor. An impact factor is a measurement, effectively, of how much you can trust the journal, how much good work is being put out, how much it's following the actual standards of the scientific method, etc., 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 etc. So not only, if something is published doesn't mean that it's good, and it definitely doesn't mean that it necessarily has anything to do with the consensus. In fact, oftentimes, those things that are published in things that are like predatory pay-for-play journals are counter to the consensus. Very often. So it's all the good science that gets published in the good journals, and that is where we derive our consensus from, right? No, still not. No. You see, the larger body of work then has to be understood and looked upon. The major leading people in the field who have demonstrated that they are trustworthy, that they understand, they can demonstrate their expertise in this specific thing, then get together, have fancy conferences where they drink fancy wine and eat fancy cheese, and debate and discuss. And then oftentimes they will publish, something that basically explains what the current consensus is. But that's the most important word in there. Current consensus. It's an uncomfortable thing for a lot of people that science changes. They don't really like that unless it actually feeds their argument. Things like, well, we can't trust science because remember when we said that cigarettes were healthy for you. Spoiler alert, the massive majority of scientists, the consensus of scientists, were saying that no, cigarettes are actually bad for you. The only people who specifically were saying that cigarettes were healthy for you were actually paid off, and they got discredited. That's how this whole thing works. That is a good example of science policing itself. But that's not how you're going to hear it from some of the people who are like science denialists or people who say that science is religion. Instead, that's a perfect example of how you can't really trust these stuffy-shirted white Oxford people in their ivory towers. And that's not even to say that necessarily the scientific consensus is the best damn thing in the world, and that it is infallible. Of course it's fallible. Everything is fallible. But it is the best we have so far, with the people who understand it the best so far. And there are people who are good scientists that go counter to the mainstream, and they do challenge these things. And it's good that they do, because that's part of the process. We need those people to possibly revolutionize things when the consensus has overlooked something. That's important. But that isn't to say that every single maverick scientist out there is somehow working on the same appreciable level of good faith as everybody else, or that somebody who believes in the consensus is necessarily acting in good faith as well. These are things that you have to take on a case-by-case basis. Otherwise, you could paint a picture that poor Andrew Wakefield is just a victim of the establishment bullying him out of the public space.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
No. And there's a reason for that. And the consensus is how we find it. Archery break! Very often, when it comes to things like politics trying to interface with science, you find something really shitty start to happen. You start to see people say that we need to have a both sides of the argument conversation. And this works fine in politics. Well, we have this debate right now over this part of social policy between a Democrat and a Republican. So we need to get a Democrat and a Republican, one of equal measure, who understands their positions, to then argue it, and then we can see who comes out with the better argument and sways the most people. That works fine for politics, for social policy. It does not work fine for science. That's one of the reasons why when you have something like somebody saying, well, we need to have this conversation about climate change, so we need to have somebody who understands the anthropogenic climate change model and a climate change denialist. And that would be fair. But no, that's not fair, because you're not arguing from a position of equality. Not even remotely. The overwhelming, and I mean overwhelming, amount of evidence for anthropogenic climate change is massively than those who are counter against it. People prop up those who are counter against it because, well, we just want to have both sides of the argument, without actually understanding that the consensus is actually rather goddamn clear. The body of work, the overwhelming body of work, not just the amount of hours and effort and names, but just by the very ratio alone of the results that have been brought in through objective testing, overwhelmingly show one answer. One. Yet for some reason we want to take both sides' argument at the same equal value and measure. They're not. They absolutely aren't. By a hilarious degree. It's the same thing with GMOs. GMOs are safe. Whether you like it or not, whether you want to point to some goddamn tiny-ass stupid little study where a guy tortured a bunch of damn rats and says, well, actually, they are they're very dangerous. No, that does not change tens of thousands of studies that all make them all completely safe. Or vaccines. I know I've swayed most of you on my channel by now. Vaccines don't cause autism. Overwhelming majority of studies show them to be overwhelmingly safe. 1 in a million chance of an adverse reaction. Yet somehow, there's still question on the other two. And these are the big three that science clearly understands. And people are very resistant to it. And that's because they want to have this idea that we have to have both sides of the argument, and that both sides of the argument are worthy of equal consideration. They're not. I'm not telling you not to be skeptical of things. I'm not telling you not to look into these things yourself. No, of course not. Absolutely. Look into them. Don't just believe me. Don't just believe anybody, especially politicians. But you have to actually look at it from what actually has an immense amount of effort and effectiveness put into it versus what is just there for the consideration of the argument. And it's very frustrating. So should the consensus necessarily trump our ability for public discourse? Of course not. Of course not. But I think we do ourselves an intellectual disservice when we don't take the consensus into consideration. I think it's a bit cowardly, because we really should be throwing this in the face of people who are trying to deny science, trying to deny evidence. It makes no goddamn sense, because this is reality. This is what we understand, our best guess so far, and nobody who was saying counter to it can come even fucking close. Anyway, that's going to be it for me today with A Man Drinks Coffee in His Backyard. Has my camera this whole time been slowly turning? Anyway, thank you so much for joining me today, guys, for A Man Drinks Coffee in His Backyard. Next time, we will talk about this hard-hitting political conversation we've been having lately, which is, why won't my wife stop her damn dog from eating my chicken nuggets? Thank you. See you next time.